I wish to declare the following.
May 1939, Germany. The Second World War had not yet broken out. Nonetheless, the Third Reich was rolling out a huge secret operation across the whole German territory. Hitler's trains and trucks crossed the country, loaded with prisoners who were political opponents or Germans and Austrians deemed unworthy of the Aryan race. On May 15th, one convoy arrived at the edge of the small town of Fürstenberg, 84 kilometers north of Berlin. On board were 860 German women and 7 Austrians. They were the first inmates in the Reich's only concentration camp exclusively reserved for women and their children, Ravensbrück. The brand new camp at the time comprised 16 dormitory shacks, 2 workshop blocks, the Kommandantur guard quarters, showers, kitchens, and the infirmary called the Revier. The 9 square kilometer site was ringed by a wall 4 meters high, topped with electrified barbed wire. As the roundups continued, the number of dormitory blocks doubled to 32. The Nazis also built a bunker containing 80 cells, 1 gas chamber, and a building to house 3 crematorium ovens. Today, the dormitory blocks in Ravensbrück have gone, destroyed by the Nazis and later by the Russians when they discovered the camp. Only a handful of buildings remain. The bureau of the commandant and the SS officers, known as the Kommandantur, the crematorium ovens, and some textile factory buildings.
Ravensbrück was based on the model of Dachau. For example, the layout of the shacks in a rectangle was exactly the same in both camps.
The idea of Ravensbrück actually was developed by Himmler, and Himmler ultimately became the chief of all the concentration camps. So Ravensbrück was his plan.
The head of the SS, the police, and the Gestapo, Heinrich Himmler, was strongly attached to the idea of building a women's camp, and he himself chose the site at Ravensbrück.
Now, why he chose that, nobody knows exactly, but he knew the area. Himmler knew that area. A lot of these SS officers used to love to go hunting. They used to love to go out from Berlin. They could get out from Berlin in a day. And this was a place with lots of open spaces.
Heinrich Himmler had built the camp in a location that was isolated and at the same time well connected, since it was close to Fürstenberg station and a highway that connected some major German cities.
It was a strategic spot in the middle of the countryside, close to a peaceful lake, because Himmler had some very particular beliefs.
It was his strange ideology and fantasies about rebirth of the German soul, the German land, the German being, in a purity.
Himmler was convinced that by assembling these prisoners in the regenerative forests of the Reich, the Aryan race would be purified. Up until 1937, women had been less targeted by his policy.
We're dealing with a society that imagines itself as virile, and so there's a very strong idea that women don't think, and therefore do not represent any political danger, which explains why between 33 and 37, the Nazis didn't do anything much against women.
But from 1937 on, the wind changed. The Nazis ruthlessly hunted down female political opponents and communists, and later Jewish and Rom women.
Hitler began to realize that, that women were being rounded up in increasing numbers and then they needed to have a place for them. and so he devised this idea of a specific concentration camp.
Today, very few survivors remain to testify about their arrival in Ravensbrück.
When the train came to a halt, we all got off. We didn't know where we were. Immediately, the SS appeared, accompanied by their threatening dogs. Schnell, los, move it.
And the dogs were dressed in the same way. They had also grey uniforms on with the SS on it. And the guards were shouting away, snel, snel, snel.
We walked through the huge gateway, which was very imposing. And all we saw were the rows of blocks.
We were in a big assembly square where we collapsed with fatigue, especially thirst. Thirst is terrible. It's worse than hunger. For me, anyway, it's worse than hunger. We saw two people come to water the part of the square which we weren't in, and none of us received so much as a teaspoon of water.
We saw some very thin women file past, dragging themselves along with shovels on their backs. It was a terrible shock because they were in such a state. It made you wonder, who on earth are these women? Where are we? You never imagined you would become the same.
These women must have done some appalling things to be treated in such a way. They looked awful to us. Some of them, who were French, called to us, "You'll soon look like us." And I admit that we thought this was impossible, that they wouldn't treat us in this manner. We couldn't imagine what was going to happen to us in the time that followed.
I just turned 11 when I arrived at Ravensbrück, and so I had no idea what to expect. For what reason had we been sent to prison? What had we done? We had no idea.
Lily Leniel Rosenberg, French, arrived in Ravensbrück in 1943. The reason for her incarceration, Jewish. Marie-Josée Chambard de Lauve, French, deported age 21, arrived in 1943. Reason for incarceration, member of the resistance. Jacqueline Fleury, French, age 21 in 1944 when she arrived in Ravensbrück. Reason for incarceration, resistance membership. Selma van de Per, Dutch, deported in 1944 to Ravensbrück, age 22. Reason, resistance membership. Wanda Kulczyk-Różewicz from Poland was the first of these survivors to arrive at Ravensbrück in 1940 at the age of 18. The reason for her incarceration, resistance membership.
All Europe was there. There wasn't a country in Europe that wasn't represented in Ravensbrück.
From 1939 to 1945, convoys arrived from Poland, Austria, the Netherlands, the Soviet Union, Belgium, France, and beyond. All these women followed the same protocol on arrival.
They made us stand for 24 hours in the square before sending us to the showers. There, we had to undress fully and wait for the Germans.
Then they took everything we had, removing wedding rings, all that.
This scene and others were immortalized in the utmost secrecy by Violet Lecoq, a member of the French resistance during her captivity here. Her remarkable drawings acted as evidence during the Ravensbrück trials.
We all had to strip naked. We were so embarrassed. You know, at the time, we were very modest. I had never seen my mother naked, and she felt very awkward in front of her sons.
Then you were looked at by doctors, by a doctor who I don't think had gloves on or anything like that, and investigated you sexually as well, which was terrible.
We had to spread our legs and lean forward. Then they shined a torch underneath us to check that we hadn't hidden any valuables, like jewelry.
Then they gave us what was the only possession of the deported, which was your bowl. And we used to sleep with our bowls, because if you lost it, you got no soup and you would die much sooner.
They threw a dress to each of us, which we put on. My name disappeared. I was no longer Marie-Josée Chambard de Love. They called me 21706.
The deportees then spent a fortnight in quarantine before being put in the shacks. Each woman was identified by a piece of cloth, a yellow star for the Jewish women, a triangle for the rest. Those in the resistance were given red ones.
We were turned into shtuk, pieces that the Nazis despised. How do you withstand such a situation? That was the first shock of being in Ravensbrück.
The shock felt by the inmates as they were stripped of their identity was only the first of many. From the third-floor building known as the Kommandantur, Max Kogel ruled the camp with an iron hand until 1942. Appointed by Heinrich Himmler, he was a fervent Nazi, a notorious anti-Semite, and a cruel man.
In the initial rules at the Ravensbrück concentration camp, there was nothing about prisoners being beaten. It was Max Kogel who, in 1940, encouraged by Heinrich Himmler, asked that punishment beatings also be applied to women.
Kogel realized there was no bunker. He didn't tolerate that. He persuaded Himmler that this was necessary. The bunker was always a place of absolute horror for all prisoners. The lower levels were the scenes of torture, of beatings. And they were held in solitary confinement in darkness with no food.
To run the camp, Kogel had under his command some 50 SS troops and 55 female guards. These were prestige posts, well paid for German women of modest background. They were known as the Black Crows.
From the moment they put on their uniform, suddenly they were transformed. It took around 2 weeks for a new guard to become as brutal and as violent as the other guards.
It was forbidden to look the Nazi guards in the eyes. When they took the roll call, we had to have our heads lowered like this.
You quickly got used to being struck and slapped. Blows to the head, too.
You know, women are sometimes the worst.
The female violence remained more intensely scored in the prisoners' memories than the violence of the men, because it was unexpected.
Whether French resistance members, Polish or German, or women deported for racial motives, for all, the first torture was the roll call. 4 times a day, the prisoners were counted in the central square covering 2 square kilometers.
The first blast of the siren, which governed everything, was the wake-up at 3:20 a.m. We would go and stand outside and stay still in this position. You weren't allowed to talk with the woman next to you.
The number of prisoners counted had to correspond to the guards' list. For example, if a woman had escaped, the whole camp was left standing for hours until she was found. The women would wait here at 20 degrees below freezing in winter and in 30-degree heat in summer. It was real torture.
I can still see some of the older deported women, those who were sickly, who would pinch and slap their cheeks during the roll call. To begin with, I wondered what this gesture meant. I quickly realized they were doing this to put some color in their cheeks, because when roll call was over, any women who were not in good shape were taken aside and they would disappear forever.
Among the persecutors, 3 names have gone down in history. Joanna Langefeld, head guard until 1942, and the first head of the women's camp in Auschwitz. Maria Mandel, who took over from Joanna Langefeld at the women's section of Auschwitz. And Dorothea Binz, known as the Beautiful Bitch. The last head guard of Ravensbrück, she took part in the mass killings that took place there.
Binz, B-I-N-Z, was an extremely brutal woman who regularly struck people. I was once beaten to the ground simply because I put my hands in my sleeves when they were freezing.
She was very much a kid who was very troubled herself. She was a blonde, she was pretty, she was attractive to men. And obviously she had innate inside her some fairly sadistic tendencies, which the camp encouraged and brought out.
Officially, Dorothea Binz and her fellow guards did not have the right of life and death over prisoners, but they often killed with their bare hands or kicked people to death. Their accessories were clubs and dogs.
Himmler had worked out that with one dog, they could save on 2 or 3 extra guards.
Himmler believed that women are naturally afraid of dogs, so they were used on a much wider scale as part of the guard apparatus in concentration camps for women.
To keep the women guards happy, they lived in comfortable houses and would go ice skating in winter and boating in summer. They frequented the SS soldiers and would sometimes form intimate relationships with them.
When they left the camp, where these men and women had committed the worst horrors, they had to give the impression that they were going home, like any office employee.
50 meters from their villas, the inmates observed them.
We knew that they ate well, they had boots, they had... We had nothing. We were in the cold. They were well equipped, warmly dressed, that's for sure.
The German, Polish, and Dutch women interned in Ravensbrück, whether political prisoners, prostitutes, or those of Jewish origin, were all put in dormitory blocks. Each block, which contained up to 200 inmates, was divided into 2 symmetrical parts. In each wing, there was a dormitory and common room with latrines and a washroom in the center.
There were 3 of us per bunk, and a bunk was about 70 centimeters wide. In other words, the width for 1 person. But there were 3 of us. So you can perhaps imagine what life was like in those conditions. We were like sardines.
Deprived of all humanity, the inmates were condemned to a slow death. It was Hitler's will. But killing the prisoners was not enough for the Nazis. They had to see them suffer.
There was always a hierarchy amongst the prisoners because, of course, Himmler was a master of the art of divide and rule.
The Nazis knowingly involved the prisoners in the working methods of the concentration camps, deliberately to provoke antagonism between them. They also planted spies in the blocks to know what was going on inside and to maintain control.
The SS didn't have enough staff or guards to keep control on their own. The prisoners had to do it themselves. There's no doubt that if nobody had agreed to collaborate with the Nazi management system, these camps wouldn't have been possible to run.
At the same time, victims and persecutors, so-called capos, emerged in the men's camps in the mid-1930s and soon made their appearance in Ravensbrück, where they were known as Blokovas. One nationality that had been present since 1939 gradually imposed itself over time in these strategic posts: the Polish.
Polish women were the most widely represented nationality in Ravensbrück. Around 140,000 went through the camp. They had good knowledge of the German language, so they had more chance of obtaining these posts.
Many Polish women were capos. They wouldn't tell you this, but Polish women were not well liked in the camps. They worked for the Germans, especially the Offizieren, and in general, they were not very kind. Some people even have appalling recollections of these capos.
Through their dedication to duty, some Polish inmates even succeeded in winning the respect of Joanna Langefeld, Ravensbrück's head guard.
She admired the Polish for their nationalism and their patriotism. However, as a good National Socialist, she had no pity for the Jewish prisoners. She was anti-Semitic and would pick these women in 1941 to send them to special centers where they carried out the extermination by gassing certain female prisoners.
If there was a hierarchy in the horror, the worst treatment in Ravensbrück was reserved for Jewish women. Jews had been present in the camp since 1939 and accounted for 15% of the female population there. From 1944 on, thousands of Jewish women were sent there from Auschwitz or else deported there directly, on their own or with their children, both girls and boys.
The only children who were deported were Jews and Roms. We were destined to be eliminated from the surface of the planet.
On the night of October 27, 1943, Lily, aged 11, was sleeping peacefully in the family apartment in Roubaix, northern France, when she heard the boots of the SS in the stairwell.
This date remains indelibly imprinted in my mind because it was my mother's birthday. It was on that night that the Feldgendarmerie came crashing into our house in the middle of the night at 3 in the morning. They marched up the stairs, banging on the doors. We were woken with a start. The whole family was arrested. The reason given was that we were of Jewish origin. That was our crime.
Lily was then sent to Germany with her mother and 2 brothers, aged 9 and 3. Her father was sent to Buchenwald, from where he never returned. In Ravensbrück, Lily met the same fate as thousands of other deported Jewish women.
They were kept separate from the other prisoners. They were given less breaks from the slave labor. They were slurred by the guards. They were called Jewish bitch. And many of the prisoners probably felt a certain anti-Semitism towards them as well.
Whether due to overcrowding or simple Nazi pragmatism, it is hard to say why some Jewish women were sent to Ravensbrück rather than elsewhere. It is also hard to say how many Jewish women and children died in Ravensbrück. But one thing is sure, even before the construction of a gas chamber at the camp, their chances of survival were much lower than any other group in the camp.
The Nazis, according to their whim, would sometimes pluck a child from one block or another, and that child would never be seen again. Every evening when she returned from work, Mama anxiously wondered, will I find my little children waiting for me?
Political prisoner was much better. Mind you, many of them were killed or died just the same, but not as automatically as when you were Jewish. There was no question about not being sent to Auschwitz.
Selma van der Per was 22 when she was deported to Ravensbrück. A member of the resistance, she hid her Jewish identity until the liberation, as did Denise Vernet, the sister of Simone Weil.
I was afraid of that all the time, yeah. I pushed my real identity away as much as possible. I was scared that I was going to talk in my sleep. I was scared all the time about that, yes, yes.
The Jewish were always singled out for worse treatment than the rest of the prisoners. And this went through right till the very end.
And yet, amidst the nightmare of the Jewish women's bloc, there were rare moments of happiness.
There was a Polish lady who was amazing. And when there weren't too many SS around, she gathered us together and told us, sing something. For those few minutes when we were singing, we thought we had already left the camp and were perhaps at home. They were exceptional moments. De Gaulle, come quick and save us from here. De Gaulle, I beg you, if you don't come, we will all be done for. De Gaulle, do not forget us.
As the population in Ravensbrück continued to grow, numbering more than 2,000 prisoners, Germany was making territorial gains in an ever more brutal war. Wehrmacht tanks entered France. The French capitulated. Paris was declared an open city. Soon after, women began joining the resistance. Among them was Jacqueline Fleury, who was 17 at the time.
I'm from a family who objected strongly to the occupation. The whole family became active in the resistance movement.
Jacqueline joined the Defense of France group. One of her missions was to carry the movement's clandestine newspaper from Paris to Versailles.
Seeing the swastika flying over the Chateau de Versailles was unacceptable for us. Totally unacceptable. And without any need for discussion, we thought we had to do something against this occupying force.
At the end of June 1944, she was arrested in her home by the Gestapo after 4 years of resistance activity. Only her brother managed to escape.
My father, mother, and I were arrested in late June of '44 and taken to Fresnes prison. We were taken there in a black Citroën, which I think was familiar to all resistance members who were arrested.
From Fresnes prison, Jacqueline was sent to Ravensbrück, the most frequent destination for those deported from occupied France under repressive measures. Among the French resistance members in the women's camp along with Jacqueline, some became well-known figures, like the ethnologist Germaine Tillion, Geneviève de Gaulle, the general's niece, and Denise Vernet, the sister of Simone Weil. But this was only part of the picture.
You had sort of French aristocrats, you had countesses mixed up with kind of French prostitutes, with French lawyers, with all sorts. They were all mixed up.
The French women were among the most hated in the camp, despised by the Slavic inmates who found them too precious.
When the French women found out some Polish women were due to be shot, they would come to see us and say, "Give me your scarf. You won't be needing it now."
The Slavs, they're physically tougher, and the French were physically very weak right from the start. They were much more delicate. So the French start dying very quickly.
The French women, who arrived in Ravensbrück later than the other nationalities, were assigned the hardest tasks.
This very quickly left its mark on us. We were soon just skin and bone. Since we hardly ate anything, you wither away very quickly. You unload coal wagons for 12 hours. You get home, you've got nothing to change into. You only have water. You've got nothing to wash with. You're in a terrible state of fatigue. And the next day, you're woken at 4:30. You head off for another 12 hours of the same work. And when the road was finished, they tore it up to start again. Can you imagine living like that? Do you think that's enough?
The Nazi guards also hated the French women and never appointed them as blokovas.
Ah, yes, the howls, the screams, the blows from the Offizieren, and even the SS. All that was part of everyday life. You should remember there were quite a lot of us French women, and we weren't very easy to manage.
The Germans also had a very firm idea about France and saw the French as hereditary enemies of Germany. The French women were not trustworthy.
We often heard them say, "You French women, you're very poor workers." If they only knew how delighted we were to hear that, then maybe they wouldn't have said it so often. But we were very happy about that, because we were doing it deliberately, obviously.
June 1941. Germany broke the German-Soviet pact and attacked Russia. To execute his plan, Hitler mobilized millions more soldiers. The Nazi war machine depended on the output of German industry more than ever.
They had to produce more and more military equipment and munitions, and this led to companies involved in war-related production to set up on an increasingly large scale as part of the concentration camp system.
From 1942 onwards, companies such as IG Farben, Porsche, Balzen, Bosch, and Opel began to rely on the concentration camp mechanism. Siemens moved into Ravensbrück. Its vast factory, made up of 16 workshop blocks, used the deported women as labor.
The inmates would be leased and made available without wages by a private company which paid the SS a variable sum.
Germany would become an immense war factory, and deportees formed a workforce which cost nothing. When a deportee died, they were immediately replaced.
The women deported to Ravensbrück were particularly useful, Himmler believed. They had smaller hands, so could carry out more precise and meticulous tasks.
We were quite simply slaves, no two ways about it.
Between the slavery, torture, and secret transports to the gas chambers, Ravensbrück in 1942 was a hellish prison regime. But the Nazis would sink yet further in the horrors they perpetrated. In 1942, Hitler lost one of his key men. Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Main Security Office, died as the result of an ambush in Prague. The SS doctor, Karl Gebhardt, was dispatched to save him in vain. Hitler was furious.
It was Karl Gebhardt who decided on the treatment, but his approach was criticized. If he had used the new antibacterial drug sulfonamide, Heydrich could have survived.
To preserve his reputation, Gebhardt set out to demonstrate the ineffectiveness of sulfonamide, a forerunner of antibiotics, on gangrene. And Ravensbrück would be the arena of his medical experiments. These were carried out in the Revier, the infirmary block, a double building covering 1,500 square meters, connected by a corridor comprising 20 rooms, including 7 wards for the hospitalization of inmates, an operating theater, an examination room, and offices. That day, a group of inmates were presented to a college of Nazi doctors. The women were all in perfect health, and they were Polish.
The Nazis considered Jews as a sort of subhuman. So any experiments on them would not be conclusive when applied to Aryans. So they had to use human subjects that they saw as closer to Aryan, made up of Polish, a subcategory in terms of Nazi ideology, but nonetheless a form of humanity closer to the German.
Since its creation in 1939, the infirmary in Ravensbrück was not like any ordinary hospital.
In general, when anyone went to the Revier, it was to die. I shared a bunk with a woman who had died in the night, and another who was coughing up blood.
But in 1942, the diabolic mind of Heinrich Himmler came up with the idea of using inmates at Ravensbrück as human guinea pigs, prefiguring Mengelé's work in Auschwitz. Karl Gebhardt was put in charge of this mission.
The concentration camp system offered SS doctors subjects, in this case human beings, who were seen as raw material that could be used in a whole range of medical experiments.
One of these guinea pigs survived, Wanda Kulczyk-Różewicz. We tracked her down to the Polish capital, Warsaw.
On that day, they took me into the operating theater in a wheelchair. I had no idea why I was being taken there. They injected us with a liquid. We were laid down, completely drowsy. We didn't know what was going to happen to us. We were in good health.
They were the most horrific mutilations that were carried out on legs primarily, but not only on legs, where they were their bones were deliberately broken and their muscles were crushed, and they were infected deliberately with gangrene and with other incredibly infectious diseases.
The subject had pieces of glass and splinters of wood pushed into open wounds and were injected with diseases like typhus and gas gangrene. Gebhardt's experiments not only violated every ethical code, but they demonstrated nothing. Disoriented and semi-conscious, Wanda was unsure how many days and nights she stayed in the Revier.
I realized they had removed one of my bones. Our legs stank like rotten fish. The stench was terrible. On top of that, it was awfully hot. All in all, it was horrendous. In the eyes of the Nazis, we weren't even human.
In total, 86 deportees, including 74 Polish women, were used as human guinea pigs in Ravensbrück, as these clandestine photos show. 23 would die as a result of these experiments. Having had nerves, muscles or bones removed, the survivors tended to hop around and were given the cruel nickname of rabbits.
Those young Polish women walked with difficulty. They had wounds on their legs, and we learned from fellow inmates that they had been used as guinea pigs. It was more than a shock, it was unimaginable, not only inhumane, but we'd never even thought such a thing could happen.
1 year later, in February 1943, the Nazis suffered a crushing defeat in Stalingrad. They were losing ground. The Allies landed in Italy. Yet Ravensbrück seemed cut off from the rest of the world. And the rabbits were still undergoing the most inhuman torture, and executions intensified. Then in March 1943, the mutilated inmates attempted the unthinkable.
We organized a sort of march of the infirm. We wanted to see the commandant. We wanted to tell him that the prison, the operations, the firing squads, it's all getting to be too much, don't you think?
The response of Fritz Sörhen, the camp's new commandant, to these grievances was to issue orders for 4 of the protesters to be executed. The human guinea pigs continued to rail against the Nazi machine. The head guard, Johanna Langefeld, came to their defense.
Johanna Langefeld found out that these women were due to be executed because they had been summoned by her hierarchy. That was when she picked up the phone and called the commandant.
Langefeld was herself stripped of her functions for insubordination. After the war, despite her involvement in the killing of Jewish women, some Polish women helped her escape the prison where she'd been incarcerated, thereby avoiding trial. In Ravensbrück, despite Langefeld's intervention, on February 4, 1945, the Polish women were ordered not to leave their block. Their execution was approaching.
They had to be killed because they would be the living witnesses, the living evidence of this war crime.
The rabbits probably would have been killed if other inmates had not risked their lives to save them.
A general roll call was announced. All the prisoners were assembled in the square. And they had to stand there until guards identified them. One inmate created a diversion, shouting out that there was some bread available somewhere. The starving prisoners all rushed to that place, sparking chaos, which allowed the Polish women to hide.
They were hidden in the roof of the blocks, they were hidden in the hospital block, and they were pretended to be dead, or they were disguised, or they were dressed up in other clothes. And they were moved at night. If it was felt that the guards knew where they were, then the prisoners came together and sort of moved them from block to block.
The prisoners hid the rabbits in other blocks. They did, for example, swap their prisoner numbers for those of inmates who were already dead. They were helped by the whole camp. The whole camp tried to save them, and what's more, succeeded.
Despite the incessant hunt that continued up until the liberation of the camp, the Nazi guards never put their hands on the rabbits in what was a powerful act of resistance in the history of the concentration camps. In 1944, German forces were teetering all over Europe. The Reich was collapsing. And yet, this was when the Nazis would generate even more victims with the mass deportation of Jews to carry out their project of extermination and the dismantling of resistance networks. So far, the Nazi doctors at Ravensbrück had managed to control the occasional pregnancy by performing abortions on any deportee who arrived pregnant, but now the inmate population was exploding.
They simply couldn't carry out abortions at the rate that was necessary to stop babies being brought in the camp. So this extraordinary idea was arrived at, which was that we will let the babies be born and then we'll let them die.
Fritz Suren started the Kinderzimmer, a ward for children, to which French resistance member Marie-Josée Chambard de Lauve was assigned as a medical student.
I entered this room and was appalled to find newborns piled up on the beds where they were being kept. They looked like little old men. It was horrific.
That was one thing for which I could never forgive the Germans. The children in the camps, the things we saw.
The technique of starvation had already been tried by the Nazis. In Ravensbrück, it was applied to babies and their mothers.
The food was so appalling that the state of their bodies was just not producing any breast milk. So that's an added torture, that not only have you given birth to this baby, but you then can't feed the baby.
So once again in Ravensbrück, an act of resistance was organized. The deportees who still had any milk, often the Rom women who were more robust, breastfed babies other than their own. It was an act of desperation.
In Ravensbrück, I saw comrades who died. There were executions, but for me the worst was the Kinderzimmer.
With the advent of the Kinderzimmer in 1944, Ravensbrück had sunk to fresh depths of horror.
That violence was part of a very particular stage in the war, a time when the mass murder of anyone who could constitute a danger began.
The Nazis wanted to take their murderous ideology regarding the supposed inferior races to its grim conclusion, and at the same time silence the witnesses and victims of their crimes.
Germaine Tillion, the French prisoner who wrote about this, said it was la chasse. It was la chasse. They were hunting them down like animals. And that was the last days of Ravensbrück.
In 1943, the Nazis had already built 3 crematorium ovens in Ravensbrück to burn the bodies of women killed by shooting or injection, or who simply died due to the conditions. To step up the pace of killing, the extermination now took place in the camp's gas chamber. Here, from the start of 1945, the Nazis packed in up to 180 people at a time. None of the inmates were ignorant of what was going on there.
There were several ways of killing people, of course. I was dead scared to go to the doctor, because if you were going to be sent to the Riviera, that they might inject you. And that's how people died and were taken to the cremation.
Mama tried to shield us from death. It was sometimes present, but you know, you can hide it from a little child by pretending the person is asleep or saying they went to the hospital to be treated. So when a dead person was removed, you didn't realize.
We knew our fellow inmates. We knew their real names. And when they died, they would tell us, if you ever get back home, tell them how I died.
At the time, I thought a lot about France, because I thought I'd never see it again.
Between January and April 1945, in just 3 months, nearly 6,000 women and children died in the gas chamber at Ravensbrück. June 6, 1944. While the Nazis continued the mass murder in Ravensbrück, the Allies landed in Normandy. But in the Reich's other territories, Poland, Austria, Germany itself, the liberation was still a long way off.
When we heard about the D-Day landings, we said to ourselves, we're not going to spend another winter here. But unfortunately, there was lots of fighting. It took a lot longer than we'd hoped. It was interminable. We had to hang on to the end.
The deportees had to wait for long months, during which millions more fell victim to the Nazi killing machine. Auschwitz was liberated on January 27, 1945. Buchenwald on April 10th, and Ravensbrück on April 30th by the Red Army.
Some of the Russian commanders were obviously horrified by what they saw and did everything they could to help. There was also a very dark side to the liberation, because of course the Russian Red Army was notorious for rape of women.
Among the ranks of the prisoners who were finally freed was Marie-Josée Chambard-de-Lauve, a French resistance member who had spent 2 years in the camp.
The French women all sang the Marseillaise at the top of their voices. It was incredible.
Lili Lenière Rosenberg was transferred in early April 1945 to Bergen-Belsen. Having been liberated, she returned to France with her 2 little brothers. She was reunited with her mother later.
What revenge over the Nazis? And it's true, it's a kind of revenge. How else can you explain that 3 little children returned, that a child aged 3½ survived?
French resistance member Jacqueline Fleury and her mother avoided the death marches before returning to France and to the reception center for deportees at the Lutetia Hotel in Paris.
There were lists pinned up in the lobby, as far as I remember, and we were asked lots of questions. It was very hard. It wasn't just, "We're home, that's great." Not at all. And then the following morning, they gave you 10 francs and a metro ticket, and that was it. You went home.
Piecing oneself back together, having survived Ravensbrück in a France that wanted to forget, was certainly no easy task. The trials which took place from 1946 to 1950 did, however, allow certain women who'd been in the French resistance to tell their story.
I knew the names of the commandant and the doctors at the camp. So after the war, I testified against them. In principle, I'm against the death penalty, but I thought it was quite appropriate that those in charge at Ravensbrück were executed.
In 1947, Karl Gebhardt was sentenced to death, having been found guilty of murder, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The Commandant Max Kogel was arrested by the US Army but committed suicide in his cell in 1946. Fritz Sören was sentenced to death and shot in 1950. The guard Dorothea Binz was executed in 1947. Yet despite the trial and its singularity, the Ravensbrück camp long remained a footnote in the history of the war.
The people who write the history are usually men, and men were simply not interested. Male historians were not interested, and indeed most of them are not today interested in Ravensbrück. And they showed extraordinary ignorance about Ravensbrück. The prosecuting lawyer, who was actually a British barrister, trying to explain Ravensbrück to the judges, described it as that. He said he had to understand this not just as a crime against him, but a crime against women, because they were very specifically crimes.
Fortunately, the precious accounts of the survivors still resonate, notably the celebrated writings of the French resistance member, Germaine Tillion.
I owe the fact that I survived first and foremost to good fortune, then to anger and the will to expose these crimes, and lastly, to a coalition of friendship, because I had lost the visceral desire to live.